Well, good morning and welcome to the latest in the series of Unify webinars for the European Year of Rail. Today we are discussing the topic of interoperability and standards and their vital contribution to the creation and delivery of an efficient and attractive railway system. I'm Chris Jackson, Editor-in-Chief of Railway Gazette International, and it's a great pleasure to be invited to moderate this discussion today. As we know, standards and specifications play an essential role in countless sectors of industry and business, ensuring that all parties can work to a common understanding and keep costs under control. They're particularly critical in rail, underpinning a hard-earned reputation for safety and ensuring operational efficiency. Over the past 30 years, the reform of the rail sector and the gradual emergence of the single European railway area has brought an increased focus on interoperability, leading to the establishment of the TSIs to replace national rules and ensure cross-border compatibility. Implementation of the fourth railway package is just the latest step in a continuing process, but standards will continue to evolve as the technologies develop. So what are the long-term objectives driving the technical framework for the European railway sector? What can we learn from recent experience and what can we harness from other industries? To discuss these topics, I'm joined by a very experienced panel of speakers who I hope will give us an exchange of views from the perspectives of different stakeholders. Dr. Joseph Doppelbauer has been Executive Director at the EU Agency for Railways since January 2015. He holds a doctorate in physics and has worked at Alcatel and then Bombardier Transportation. He's got more than 30 years experience in the rail sector, notably in signalling, and he says a passion for driving innovation. He served as both chairman of the European Rail Research Advisory Committee and the Shift to Rail Steering Committee. Perhaps not surprisingly, he's been involved with the development of the European Rail Traffic Management System since the early 1990s. Bringing a view from outside the rail sector, Elena Santiago Cid is Director General of CEN and CENELEC, two of the three recognised European standardisation bodies. CEN and CENELEC work through a network of stakeholders to create consensus-based standards to meet market requirements, open up market access and enhance innovation. She's also president of Women for Cyber Foundation, which promotes the role of women in the field of cybersecurity. Representing the EU member states, Claire Liégeois has worked at the Rail Directorate of Belgium's Ministry of Mobility and Transport since 2011, becoming head of rail regulation last year. She's responsible for implementation of the technical pillar and the reduction of national rules in Belgium. She represents the country in several rail bodies, including OTIF and the Risk Committee, and has been chair of the ERA Management Board since 2017. From the rail supply sector, Nicolas Castres-Saint-Martin is the Chief Technology Officer at Alstom. He's a graduate from the École Polytechnique and INSTA and began his career in the military industry before joining Alstom in 1984. He's held various roles in engineering and rolling stock, and becoming CTO in Alstom, or confirmed as CTO in Alstom again following the acquisition of Bombardier. He represents Alstom on the governing board of Shift to Rail. He also sits on the board at Certifair and is vice president of the Railenium Research Institute. So a lot of experience there. That's our panel. We're going to split the discussion into 5 or 6 areas, looking at the European technical framework, global standardization, framework for competition, the 4th railway package, and enabling innovation. It's a wide-ranging subject area, and I'm sure that you're going to have a lot of questions to ask the panelists. You can submit these at any point during the discussion, clicking on the question mark icon at the top of your screen. You can see on the slide. We'll try to take questions as we go through, but hopefully there'll be a few minutes at the end where we can wrap up any that we've missed. So without further ado, let's turn to the first area of the technical framework. EU railways have undergone some fairly extensive regulatory reforms since 1991, particularly through the 4 legislative packages that were adopted in 2001, 4, 7 and 16. Those saw the establishment of the EU Agency for Railways and the technical specifications for interoperability, which have been under constant development for almost 20 years. Today, there are 11 TSIs supported by direct reference to 143 standards, and indirectly an awful lot more. While this is an achievement, some suggest this regulatory framework has become too complex, which was hinted at the Council conclusions on the Commission's Smart Mobility and Sustainable Mobility Strategy. So, Joseph, can I start with you? Where do you think we stand with the regulatory system and technical harmonisation? After 30 years, are we at a mature stage? What more is needed, and what do we do to simplify the system?
Well, many thanks, Chris, for the introduction, and good morning, everyone. Before I would reply to your detailed question, I would like to put this entire question of interoperability in perspective. Why is it important to discuss it? And there are 4 important aspects. The first one is the customer perspective, and I believe we should always start from the customer perspective. And of course, for both a passenger and a freight operator, it is important to have a frictionless travel possibility across Europe so that you can travel seamlessly from one country to the other. The second important aspect, now coming more to the suppliers, is the market perspective, meaning that you have a large unfragmented market, which is important for the global competitiveness of the European industry. Then, very importantly, we have the dimension of system evolution. And here, one of my frequent sayings is that standardization provides flexibility. Some people consider this as a contradiction, but I'm convinced that we can only innovate when we standardize before. And lastly, we have the policy perspective, and there aspects like accessibility, public safety, and sustainability play a key role. Now, you ask me what was the progress made over the past 30 years, and undoubtedly a lot of progress has been made, not to the least since we are now in the technical pillar of the 4th railway package. We have all member states on board, and we as ERA have now authorized already more than 21,000 vehicles. But we are not yet at the desired situation. And I believe one of the key elements that we should discuss today is the question of national. You referred to the complexity. But the regulatory system in Europe is complex because we have several levels. We have the level of European regulation, and then we have the national regulation, which is at times in contradiction to the European rules. And there, I believe we must continue the cleaning up. Unfortunately, we are not provided with the necessary resources at the agency, but it is for me a very important next step that we come to a truly European railway system based on European standards, based on European rules. And in terms of maturity, I believe we can still progress further towards the direction that is already seen in other sectors, like aviation. We need to give more responsibility to the actors, to the accredited and recognized bodies, but also to the manufacturers. And we need to reduce the TSIs. We need to reduce the TSIs to the optimum level of mandatory harmonization. The TSIs itself should become smaller, and that should then give more importance to the standards. And I'm sure that Elena will have a view on that. But I'm saying we are on a good way, but we are not yet there.
Well, on a good way, but not there. And cleaning up national rules. Cleo, that is part of your remit. Do you want to explain, maybe use Belgium as a case study, but look at where we're going in that sector?
Yes, sure. Thank you, Chris. Good morning, everybody, and thanks for the opportunity to discuss all of these very important topics with you today. Looking back 10 years ago, what we were doing with national rules was that
Have we lost Cleo?
Can you hear me? Hello?
Hello? No, I think we lost you
Yeah.
for a minute. You're back now.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. I hope you can hear me. So I was saying that looking back at what happened with national rules, we had in the past historical operators who were managing the rules for us. And 10 years ago, we decided that we wanted to take them back and have them harmonized and make them public and transparent by putting them in national law. And then afterwards, we decided that really what we wanted was in the context of the liberalization and the fact that we wanted all railway operators and the industry to be able to manage flexibly the rules, that they had to have another transition and that they had to go back really to the sector. And so what I'm a bit doubtful about is the rebranding of national rules, because I believe they have never disappeared. They have just moved around. This is what we are still doing. For the future, what I think we need is what Joseph has been mentioning, more responsibility, because it will come with more flexibility as well for the operators in general. And it means that they must take hold of the standards, but they must also agree on how to manage them together. The biggest challenge we have in Belgium is a very fragmented sector, in the sense that we don't have a real organization managing the standards for the whole sector, which means that the biggest challenge is cooperation, and therefore it makes contractors very much, in doubt as to which standards they should commonly apply. So for me, the future will be putting people together in order to work to have common standards inside the EU in general, but also at national level, certainly, as long as we have national rules and national systems. Thank you.
Yeah. Can I come back quickly on that? That some of the national rules are sort of time and practice. Others are dictated by national peculiarities in the infrastructure, and you have specificities in terms of loading gauge, weight, so on. And standardizing infrastructure constraints is obviously a costly exercise. So to what extent can you get rid of national rules that are determined by constraints over and above the European standards, and who's going to pay for resetting all the systems?
We will not get rid of it, at least that's my view. We will not make them disappear, but we will make them more easy to work with, and we will put them at the service of the people who are using them. And this is what we're trying to do. And who's going to pay? Well, we are. The States is, in the sense that we are trying to help the sector by providing consultancy services, really, to help them understand the historical rules we had. And we have a clear mission to do that, to interpret them and to give explanation to them, and then help them putting all the rules together and making them, up to date and more flexible. So we are going to help in this transition, but it is not something that will be done overnight. It will take time, but it is the direction which we must all, go to, and certainly with the help of the sector. And this is why, again, we need a sector that can speak with one voice, and this is what we're missing for me at the moment in Belgium.
Okay, thank you. Nicola, can I bring you in there? One of the things both Joseph and Cleo talked about is enabling the manufacturers, the rail sector themselves, to take more responsibility for how they use the standards and the specifications. Is that something you welcome, or are you slightly worried about how people will interpret the standards?
Oh, yes, of course. So thank you very much for inviting me as a panelist to this meeting. But if I may, I would like to to come back on the maturity a little bit. I think, as far as fundamentals are concerned, I think with the current TSI baseline, safety and interoperability are already ensured as far as regulation is concerned. So from this standpoint, I think maturity is not so bad. And of course, there are further changes that are aiming at making the system more efficient, thanks to DAC or ATO. And this is fully welcome, provided it does not jeopardize the financial stability of the railway stakeholders. Because what we really want is that projects related to a product range are not impacted by regulatory changes happening during the business life of this range. Private companies should not be asked to bear the financial consequences of regulatory decisions. And especially as you may know now, the change of law risk is less and less assumed by our customer, I mean the customer of the suppliers. And so we need for some stability, which does not mean freezing things, but some stability. So now on the other hand, of course, maybe there is a lack of maturity, which is due to the complexity Joseph has already mentioned. Because, while it is very heavy and extensive, our regulation repository is sometimes not explicit enough, needing additional explanatory documents as guidelines, a line to take for effective implementation. And up to me, this is mainly the result of a too high complexity. So why not making regulations simpler, more explicit, to limit these additional documents to the minimum? And if any needed, why not allocating them to Sensenelec to onboard all actors of the sector and to benefit from their proper consensus-based approach and documentation management? So how to simplify? I think basically clarifying and clearly differentiating TSI and norms scopes, making TSI lighter through addressing only interoperability-related high-level functionalities and interfaces, and standards addressing all other technical topics.
Right, so that kind of gets to what Joseph was saying before about slimming down the TSIs and putting more things in standards. Is that the route you want to go, Joseph?
Well, absolutely. And what I referred to before about the role of standardization and regulation in innovation, it is important to realize that in a shared system like the railway system, major innovation can only be introduced by regulation. We have the infamous example of IATMS, but for me, the most illustrating example comes from history. Track gauge in the UK. because in the 1840s, it didn't really matter whether the track gauge was exactly to the inch, because the individual lines were not connected. And only in 1846, it was realized, when two railway companies merged, that they couldn't use their wagons on the other company. And then regulation was introduced to standardize on what is now the famous 1434-5 standard gauge. And it took still until 1892 to arrive at the single track gauge, and not in the UK, because Ireland still have a different gauge, but at least in England, you arrived at the standard gauge. So it took 46 years from regulation to harmonization. With ERTMS, we are now approaching 30 years. But if we really want to introduce new solutions quickly, we need to have the optimum level of harmonization. We need to have the optimum level of regulation. And of course, we need to heavily rely on standardization.
Absolutely. I could say that it took 46 years in the UK because the people who passed the regulations didn't provide the money to actually enable the private companies to implement the regulations. They had to earn the money to pay the cost of regauging everything. But that aside, I think it's time we should hear from Elena. We've talked about Senelec and moving some of the standards out of the TSIs and making them into SEN standards. Is that a process that's happening in other industries? Is that a role that you would welcome as part of a sort of standard setting organization? You're on mute, I'm afraid, Ellen. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Well, first I wanted to say thank you to UNIFE and to congratulate all of you that are heavily invested in railways, because this is the year of rail, 2021. We are all virtual, but I think it's very important to give the importance to this sector, the importance that it deserves for the European economy. So I think it's a year to celebrate. I would like to start by clarifying what do we mean by standards, because we speak about standards, and I think that everybody has got a different understanding. The standard I will speak about are the European standards that are produced by the European Standards Organization, SENS and ETSI. There is a regulation in Europe that clearly defines what a European standard is, and these standards are adopted identical by all the members of SEN and SENELEC, and national conflicting standards are withdrawn. This is total harmonization for Europe, and this is not only for the railway sector. It covers multiple sectors, and from toys, construction, chemical, machinery, pressure equipment, and you say so. So it is very important to understand that there are different categories of the standards or different type of standards, but the standards that we are referring to today are European standards that are adopted identical by all the members of SEN and SENELEC, and national conflicting standards withdrawn. And it's a fact that European standards have been contributing to the single market and to interoperability in Europe. There is one national standard body per country, or a national committee in the case of SENELEC, and they are responsible to put together all the different stakeholders. Now, TSIs. The railway sector is a very particular sector, because normally, what we understand by the new legislative framework is that the legislation establishes the essential requirements and safety, security, environmental protection, interoperability, and we developed the European standards on a voluntary basis that satisfy the requirements that are described in the legislation. But in the case of the railway sector, we have got this intermediate product that is the TSI, for historical reasons. And I must say I was very pleased to hear Joseph's statement that let's try to reduce the PSIs because I think that Europe has been embarking on the better regulation approach. I have been participating in the REFIT platform for several years. And life cycles are shorter and shorter. The objective has to be that the regulation includes what needs to be included in terms of essential requirements, and then the market needs to evolve quickly in order to be able to accommodate technological developments and to be able to enhance the competitiveness of our European industry. So we have got an excellent working mode to connect TSIs with harmonized standards, but the sector is unnecessarily complex from my point of view. So if we could go, and there I would endorse what Nicola has said, if we could go for a system where we have got a clear need, regulatory framework, and then we can use standards that accommodate and adapt to the state of the art to support those legal requirements, that would be the ideal situation. Because what is happening today is that, first of all, it's complicated. So for an SME, for instance, to understand how the legislation is applied and how they can even contribute to the standard development process and where they need to contribute, it's quite a challenge. And second, because we want innovation-friendly legislation. And innovation-friendly legislation, the European model, it has been very envied in terms of the standards referred to in legislation, because it enables to innovate at the same time as applying legislation. So this is something that I think we need to continue working upon. It will reduce unnecessary delays in the use of technical adaptation and implementation of the legislation. It will make a better use of those experts that are devoting their time and energy and knowledge to the standardization activities. And I know that we will speak after about global competition, but we do not have so many experts. So let's try to make the best of the experts that we have in Europe to, at one side, support public interest, but also make sure that we are more and more competitive in a sector in which we have been dictating the international standards for many years. And unfortunately, we are seeing a delay in that approach. So I hope that this can enable further discussions.
Absolutely. I was going to come, one of the questions I was going to come back to you on is in terms of looking beyond Europe and sort of global standards. We know that the world railway market is growing, and European suppliers particularly still have a very substantial dominant market share. How far does Europe set the global standards, and how far does Europe react to standards that are set in other places? And how do we relate? Do you have a process at Senelec keeping an eye on what's going on outside Europe?
Yeah. So it's a very, very interesting question, and I must say we are putting a lot of energy to highlight the strategic geopolitical importance of the standardization. To answer to your question, yes, we have a system in place. We have got an agreement with ISO, an agreement with the IEC in SEN and Senelec that enable SEN and Senelec to work in ISO and IEC and be able to influence the international standardization system so that we can have standards happening in the international level and the European one at the same time. This is the ideal situation because it will be Europe leading technology that is included in international standardization. What is happening today is that we need in Europe much more consistency amongst the different policies that are directly or indirectly using a standardization. So I'm here talking not only about interoperability of railways or the fourth railway package, but we have got the trade policy review, for instance, where we talk about strategic supply chains in Europe, strategic dependencies, indirect dependencies. We need to connect that with the industrial strategy, where there is also a very important reference to a standardization. And then we need to talk about the green and the digital transition, where there is also a standardization at stake. And we need to make sure that we have got a consistent approach to a standardization. As I mentioned before, that we are able to identify when Europe can lead an international standards, coordinate all our experts from the different members of the CNS-CNLEC and the Union, because they are all members of CNS-CNLEC, and make sure that we bring this coordinated approach and a strength to the international development. I mean, I don't want to elaborate too much, but I have a beautiful example on cybersecurity, where we have developed a technical specification in Europe that is a really pioneer on cybersecurity for railway sector. And what we are trying to do, and in the international field, China is trying to move forward their own technical specification. And there, I think we are putting all our energy to put together a consistent approach to make sure that the international standard is developed based on the European one, and then it will not only be a very significant competitive advantage for Europe, but that we will also preserve the European values within the international standard development. So very, very important, and we are in an inflection point at the moment.
As you say, a lot of geopolitics in there, definitely, absolutely. Joseph, well, a question has popped up from the viewers in the feed. You know, what is the process planned about moving content from the TSIs to the standards, and how do you ensure consistency during the transition phase?
Well, we have this regular process of TSI updates, with a major update coming 2022, the so-called TSI package 2022. And this will already be a first step to, let's call it, streamline the regulation. And the aspect that we will tackle in 2022 is, and it refers to what Nicola mentioned, the transition and the change of regulation during the lifetime of a product. Mm-hmm. So we will harmonize the transition regime for all TSIs, and we will make it clear that once a certificate is issued and once a product is authorized, unless there is a major safety issue, these certificates should be valid forever. And of course, in the process of moving further to then the next package, probably coming in 2027, 2028, we can think of how can we combine certain TSIs. Does it have to be the current number, or can these be simplified? And which parts can safely be taken out? And as I mentioned in the introduction, this all has to go together with the national rules, because national rules sometimes refer to standards, in many cases UIC leaflets, and we need to move forward, but in a controlled manner. As Nicola said, we need to balance stability and change.
Absolutely. Nicola, I think it's time we hear from you, because you are, as supply sector, you are competing globally as well as within Europe. And so the relationship between TSIs, European standards, global standards is all relevant to how you operate. Are you happy with what you're hearing, or do you still have concerns?
I think globally I am happy with the spirit of what I am hearing, but you know, sometimes in the railway business, devil is in details, and so there are still things that I think we should improve. I would like to just to highlight the problem we have with the cross references between TSI and norms. You know that Recently, it has been introduced dated references, and this is very, very difficult to manage, very, very heavy, not relevant, because it generates a lot of huge administrative work to manage consistency when evolutions of TSIM norms, as they both live their own life in parallel, of course. And so we cannot use our experts, which are very scarce resources, to address such tasks that are very much time consuming without any added value. So we need to adopt a lighter and more agile way of working in this matter. Today, you have to know that more than 50% of standards-related references in TSI are outdated. For instance, an example on the driver cab arrangement, the LogPass TSI is referencing an old UIC sheet, 651 dated 2002, whilst there is now an EN norm, 16186, since 2014, addressing the same topic and unanimously recognized. So it is leading to a strange situation where bodies are asking for compliance to both, which is fully crazy. So I think any action aiming at a linear process between the voluntary world and the regulatory world should lead to a more stable framework. And I think this is something which is very important. Another thing I would like to say that I have heard that standardization is a very, very important enabler or trigger for innovation. I am not sure I fully share this view. I think standardization is a mandatory frame to frame innovation, because of course innovation has to respect the standards. But I'm not sure innovation is going to be a main trigger I'm not sure standardization is the main trigger for innovation. If you take, for instance, the hydrogen traction train or the battery train, it has not been waiting for a new standard or for standardization to happen. So for me, I think standardization should not be the main driver for innovation. Innovation may arise without any standardization, but of course standardization is a frame in which innovation must be inscripted, and so it has to be, of course, consistent with regulation and with the standardization. And on regarding competitiveness, I fully share what Elena has said before. I think is very important if we want to be strong in the world, competitive in the whole world, not only in Europe, but outside. I think it's very important we progressively migrate our EN standards to the ISO and international level, because otherwise Chinese will make our life very difficult.
Yes, some valid points there. Joseph, do you want to come back on that?
Yes, I need to give some further background to what Nicola said, innovation and standards. And we have to clearly distinguish several types of innovation. There is clearly what one could call local innovation. So this is innovation that doesn't impact any other subsystem. Yeah, but in the railway system, we have the network innovation. You cannot decide to fit your locomotive with a new train protection system if the infrastructure doesn't install it. So you need to introduce certain innovations jointly between a variety of actors, and those are the difficult innovations that need to be managed by regulation. And we should not mix the two, because otherwise we are in a situation like we are today. Again, this typical example of ERTMS, not even in 2050 we will be in a position to go from A to B in Europe with one single ERTMS. And an innovation that takes 70, 80 years is very, very slow. So there, a key role of standardization, a key role of innovation related to regulation.
Thank you. Yes, Cleo, I was going to come to you actually about this whole timescales question. I mean, Joseph just said, you know, we're talking about updates to the TSIs in 2022 and then maybe 27, 28. That's 5 or 6 years. In the past, we've seen reforms every 2 years. Is there's a longer timescales a sign of more stability in the regulatory regime, and is that presumably is a good thing, but question trade-off between reacting to change and providing the stability that the sector needs to go about its business.
Thank you for this question. Yes, indeed. I think it was Joseph who said the stability, the trade-off is between stability and change. And what we've tried to do, I think, also in the national systems, is to afford a framework from which the sector can deviate. So what we are offering is a basis, something that can be used, you know, right from the shelf. And this is really addressed to smaller players who cannot afford to develop, you know, basically their own standards and their own safety management system from scratch, because this is a huge challenge as well. I mean, we're talking about global competition, but for me, this is also the question of competition between bigger players and typically this historical operators and smaller ones who have to, you know, find their place somewhere and invent bright new systems from scratch. And this is just not possible. The business analysis won't stand it. So this is why, for me, a basic proposal, which you can use right from the shelf to start operating, is a good thing we should keep and not just delete everything. But on the other hand, for bigger players, what we offer is the basic possibility to deviate from everything. So it means that we offer something, but it is up to the sector to just provide us with an analysis showing that what they are proposing is as well as we are have been doing, and even better, all the better if they do even more. And this is why I think flexibility in law is needed also to allow innovation, because if I take our experience with that, we have been talking about innovation also, for instance, with the remote control of locomotives. This is something we are looking into in Belgium, apparently also in the context of freight wagons and freight locomotives. So this is all interesting, but it is true that in the current legal framework, you don't have the rules for that. You don't have the standards for that. And if you have a very strict legal framework, you could just not do it. Even for testing, it's not possible. So this is why we think at national level that what we need is to have a framework to allow something to be accessible for small players, but these rules must be flexible enough to allow for innovation and allow bigger players to invent their own standards and apply them in a harmonized manner. Because again, this is the biggest challenge for us. It's not just having new standards, it's that these standards are recognized and applicable by every actor and that they can work together in that. Thank you.
Yes, I know 1 or 2 countries have come up with the concept of a regulatory sandbox, where you have a sort of protected area where you can move beyond the regulations to do experiments with automation and so on, and then if presumably based on the results, you can then feed that back into the regulatory and standards regimes. It's clearly a complex process. Joseph, is that where we're going on that score?
No, that is certainly one dimension, and it also is related to the necessity to align the approach to regulation between the various modes of transport, because in the end we need to better integrate the modes of transport, meaning automotive, rail, aviation, and at the same time we need to have a level playing field, so all sectors should be regulated in a similar manner. And currently, at least that's my feeling, rail is over-regulated, whereas other sectors are under-regulated. So we need to find the balance. And one element clearly is this approach that we start from controlled trial to limited trials to gain experience, and then allow those new solutions to be used in large-scale customer services. The trick is that we have a system and we have a closely technically integrated system. So we cannot just experiment, because coming with a new car that has a track gauge that would be 2 meters would simply not run on the rail. So you have the physical limits, and other innovations have advantages for one type of stakeholders, but have massive drawbacks and consequences for another category of stakeholders. So we need to balance the technical aspect and the interests of stakeholders. But clearly, the regulation needs to become more flexible and more evolutionary.
Absolutely. I mean, in terms of track gauge, we've seen, you mentioned Ireland, but we've seen in Spain, we're seeing in India and in Japan, where new railway systems have been developed with a different track gauge for a standalone, for a specific purpose. The regulations have not prevented the adoption of new standards, different standards. The comments come up in the feed that says standardization can block innovation if it's too detailed, and so to the extent that standards need to, if you like, determine the output rather than the input, rather than specify what you need rather than how you get there.
Now, this is I can only subscribe to that, and you know that in my past, I was in a technical role in industry, and I oftentimes despaired when I saw some of the absolutely detailed rules in the standards, and I despaired even more when I found out that the proposal for these details came from my own stuff. So.
Yes, I'm sure. I think historically, it's what Cleo said back at the beginning. You know, that it was the railway sector, the national railways were used to running everything and determine everything, and they, when they procured new trains, they specified them down to the colour of the carpets and so on, and that level, that inability to step back from the detail is part of the legacy that we're grappling with.
Chris, if I have an additional point which explains the differences also between aviation and rail, and it is exactly related to the point that Cleo made, because those national operators were used to specify everything to the detail, they still do so. So meaning, as a train supplier, you are faced with very specific requirements from the particular customer. So SNCF in France has different views what the train should look like than Deutsche Bahn. If you go to aviation, and if the boss of Lufthansa would call the boss of Airbus and say, I like the A320 very much, but I would like to have the wings 10 centimeters wider and the nose 50 centimeters higher. The CEO of Airbus would tell him, you can select the color of the seats, but the rest is fixed. But in rail, unfortunately, it is different. So if Deutsche Bahn calls any of the suppliers, any supplier will do anything possible just to get the order.
Indeed. I think in the urban rail sector, it gets even worse, where the mayors of individual cities will determine the shape of their trams. Some of the big manufacturers must absolutely despair of how you can standardise. Elena, is this an issue in other sectors? Joseph talked about aviation, but this relationship between detail and standards, do you find it in other sectors apart from rail?
Chris, if I may, I would like to elaborate a little bit of some of the comments that have been made, and then I will reply to your question. The first one is the comment that Nicola has made, because indeed we have got today a very important challenge with the citation of harmonized standards in the official journal, and some of the administrative burden that has been introduced that prevent us also to use undated references. I mean, that is too detailed, but it's certainly something that is jeopardizing the European model as we know it today. And okay, there was a court case that has somehow changed the interpretation of the European Commission on the way standards supports the European legislation. However, I think that there is now a very positive period because the industrial strategy has established a task force. We are meeting this afternoon, actually, with about timely citation of harmonized standards in the official journal. So, and this is a multidisciplinary team, different DGs in the Commission and the European standards bodies, where we are going to try to define a plan before the end of the year on reducing this time for citation together as a partnership to understand why it is important that some specific standards include this specific content, what is the strategic importance to get timely citation in the official journal, and at the same time to make sure that all the legal aspects that need to be covered by the legislation, it is covered, because industry needs legal certainty, but also they need to compete in the single and in the international market. So just to mention that the users are fully aware of this challenge of citation, of the fact that we have got TSIs that are making reference to all the standards which really jeopardize the innovation-friendly legislation, and we are working with ERA also on that. We absolutely need to make sure that we reduce this time frame and that we put in practice right processes that do not jeopardize the objectives of each party. So this is the first. The second about innovation, because this is very dear to me. Well, I must say that standards make innovation happen in the market. And we have got significant and concrete examples of that. Maybe they do not, they are not innovation fostering, but what we have achieved now is introducing standardization thoughts when there is an innovation being conceived. If there is a standardized document that accompanies the innovation, then that innovation is spread most rapidly and disseminated in the market. And we have got some cases on the standards that we are developing for hydrogen application for railways. So I think we need to look at innovation from a different perspective, and also from the role that the standards can play in making innovation happen in the market. And this is something that, as we all know, has been a big issue for Europe, where we have been spending billions of euros on innovation, but we did not manage to make those innovations succeed in the marketplace. So I think it would require another session. Now, other sectors, Chris, because I haven't forgotten your question. So indeed, there is very good examples in other sectors. I would like to mention, for instance, the low voltage directive, all the electric equipment, but they are subject to installation rules. So in every country, we have got the national installation rule, yet all the national installation rules make reference to European standards. It is not possible to refer to other standards if European standards exist. I don't see why not the railway sector could use a similar approach that ensure harmonization wherever the harmonization is available and is market driven, and only use national specificities when there is an absolute need. I know this is challenging, but I think it's important to mention. And there are 42 European legislations that we support with European standards. The railway sector is the only one that has got TSIs. So I think that it would be interesting to have a look at what is happening in the machinery sector, in the pressure equipment directive, in the energy sector, because I think that there have been the liberalization of the energy sector. Standardization has played a very important role in the liberalization of the energy market. National rules were very introduced in the member states. And there is a clear evolution to the market economy and to the voluntary standardization approach that supports innovation-friendly legislation. So I think that there are plenty of case studies that we could use. Having said that, I think that the railway sector is extremely committed to European standardization. And I always prize the value that they give to the effort, which is not something so evident. Share knowledge. Sharing knowledge with your competitors that are around the table to have a compromise to support specific objectives. I think that is extremely important and very important to value in our European model that, as I said, is pretty unique in the world.
Yeah, yes, it is so ever so the challenge of cooperation and competition at the same time. Nicolas, even innovation drives standards, standards drive innovation. Are you happy with the way things are going now?
Yes, so I would like to come back on what you elaborated just before on the level of details of the standardization should go. For me, standardization should address functionalities, performances, and interfaces, but should not fix descriptive solutions. Otherwise, it hinders innovation and then it hampers competitiveness. So there is a very simple example, the example of the ERTMS DMI, which is detail defined into the CCS TSI and its subset. So format and size of information is defined, display size is defined, very detailed. And so, for instance, it prevents from any move to head-up display technology as an example. And so coming back to your question and innovation, I repeat that to me, regulation should not be the main driver for innovation. It should fix the frame, of course. But of course, regulation may raise the bar of interoperability performances should any major technology innovation may make it possible, but should not impose the related technology. So to me, the main receptacle of EU R&I should rather be the standards to be shaped throughout a wide consensus between all the actors of the railway sectors, which is, by the way, the main strength of this standardization approach.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Cleo, I see you're commenting in the feed there about the legal framework for non-compliance solutions, and this is how far do you define compliance, and where does compliance need to move into evolution of standards? You want to comment on that?
Yes, sure. Thank you, Chris. I think we are really linking back to what was said previously about having the objective given in the regulation, but the means are free, really. And so this is what, for me at least, acceptable means of compliance mean. They set the standard, they set the level of safety we want to have, of the level of interoperability we want to achieve, and then the means to reach this objective is a bit left to, well, the sector really, because we offer a proposal, we offer a framework that you can apply if you wish. But if you are able to demonstrate that you have other solutions which are as or even more interoperable or safe, well, you can apply them. You just have to demonstrate that they are indeed, as you say, as safe and as interoperable. The only limit with that, of course, for me, as I said previously, is harmonization and the fact that everybody has to be on the same line with the new means that they apply. And the biggest challenge we have with that is operational rules. So for us in Belgium, we have been really trying to work in this context of reducing the national rules. We have done a huge work in this regard, but we are still struggling with really the operational rules which regard interface between the infrastructure manager and the railway undertakings, the operators. And for us, this will remain the biggest challenge because infrastructure is there and we have to deal with that. It will not change easily. We are also implementing ERTMS and we are aiming in Belgium at a full ETCS only system by 2025. But this is, again, a huge challenge, and it doesn't mean that it will solve all the problems, because ETCS is just one part of the infrastructure. And so, therefore, for us, the acceptable means of compliance will remain something that is necessary, and operational rules, at some point, somebody has to decide on them. You cannot just leave them open for discussion. At some point, somebody has to decide. So we took what the European authorities have been saying, which is, well, the somebody deciding is no longer the member state. Okay, we agree with that, but at the end, somebody else will have to decide, and it will probably be the infrastructure manager then. So we have to admit that at some point, some rules will stay, and we will not deviate from that. There is no other way, because if I take one example, the procedure to start a train to leave the station, the procedure to leave the station is something which is clearly in interaction between what the railway undertaking is doing and what the infrastructure manager is offering. And so the system you put in place is a purely national system at this moment. And so we have at this moment in Belgium a little key which the staff personnel accompanying the train has to activate. They have to put a key into a system just to say that the train is ready to depart. And if you don't have the key, the train is never to leave the station. And so we have a rule saying you have to have the key. And so I fully agree that this is a very much outdated system, and we should really delete this. But how to do it unless we have a common system saying how the train is to depart, and everyone is in agreement with that, including certainly the infrastructure manager. So I'm just saying that this is all very, very well. I really agree with what we are aiming at, and the objective must be to give more flexibility, but we have some limits, and they are physical limits. So it will be a challenge. Thank you.
Absolutely. I mean, I've remember being told many years ago that operational rules are, well, they're so far defined by the legacy infrastructure, but somebody said 96% of operational rules are concerned with degraded modes when the infrastructure or the train fails. That if everything's running fine, the rules are fairly minimal, but you have to make rules for every eventuality, and that's where the complexity comes in. Joseph's shaking his head here. Joseph, you want to respond?
No, I would like to come back to the example that Cleo provided, and for me this is a typical example where we unnecessarily reinvent the wheel in many countries. And for me, the specific procedure in Belgium is one of the main sources why trains in Belgium are never punctual. And it is because they never depart on time. If you just look a couple of kilometers to the north in the Netherlands, they have the absolute dogma that the train has to depart on time, and they even support the guards with some apps on their mobiles so that they can absolutely depart to the second. And I see no reason why every country needs to have their own procedures, and there are best practices next door. And this is sometimes frustrating. And really, the procedures, and it's not just in Belgium, I believe you can find example everywhere where it is in the tradition. And the point is that operational rules are always argued with safety, because there has been an incident sometime in the past and somebody has defined such procedure in order to prevent a new occurrence. And this is the big issue, why we have the TSIs, why innovation is a bit more difficult, because you always need to consider the impact on the rest of the system, and therefore it is necessary that we come to an integrated and streamlined approach. So every part of the regulation has to play the role. The TSI at the highest level make sure that we can safely run trains across Europe, and the standards to make sure that we do not reinvent the wheel. And I fully subscribe to what Nicola said. The standard has to be functional, has to specify the performance, and has to specify the interfaces. And it should not specify any details. I remember the very detailed specification of the light bulb signals when we went to LED signals. Of course, it is impossible to mimic the exact light cone of a light bulb with an LED, but it is not necessary, because the necessary aspect is the visibility and not the distribution of light. So we made loads of effort to mimic exactly another type of light, but it has absolutely no contribution to the purpose that should be achieved. So purpose and function first, and then have the performance, and then have the interface, but not trying to regulate the parameters in the tiny and minute detail.
Absolutely, I think we would all concur with that as a general objective. If we, I mean, watching the time here, the fourth railway package, as finally adopted in 2016, was probably the largest single regulatory change in the European process, particularly with the transfer of vehicle authorization. And Joseph said, you know, with the now ERA has now authorized 21,000 vehicles and 1,500 decisions. The target was to reduce the time taken by 20% and reduce the cost of authorization. Is that being achieved? Have we reached those goals, or is there still more to be done on that score?
Well, Chris, if I may,
Sure.
And the question comes timely, because just yesterday we had in our first railway package steering group a discussion on the return of experience, and we need to be rather precise in comparing apples with apples and peers with peers. If we talk of the authorization of freight wagons, not much has changed. In the past, one authority, normally a national safety authority, in many cases Germany or Netherlands, now one authority, ERA. In principle, not so much has changed. But we had the other cases, and just about 2 weeks ago, I signed an authorization for an area of use of 10 countries. And there, of course, the difference in time and cost is dramatic. In 2012, before the fourth railway package, there was a study carried out, and then the duration for authorizing a locomotive was found to be 46 months, close to 4 years. Now we do it in 5 months, so we are far beyond the 20%. So we need to now look very carefully. What are the areas where we have met the goals? What are the areas where we can improve our processes? But also, what are the areas where we need to improve or even change regulation? Because regulation is the stumbling block, not the process. And in some cases, and we still see it, that we need to work on the dissemination, on the knowledge of the applicants. And this ranges from very good applications to cases where the agency is abused as a consultant, where we get some very immature ideas, and then our assessors refine the design iteratively, because they will always throw it back, and then we get a new version. And of course, that is not the way it was intended, but unfortunately, it happens as well.
Sure, Nicolas, as a manufacturer, I'm sure you're in the good books category in terms of knowing how the processes work. But is this a role for bodies like UNIFE to help with the dissemination of process to make sure the applicants are right, and that everybody understands how the new authorizations work?
Well, you know, I think for the fourth railway package, there are quite a lot of steps forward which are very good and which have been fully achieved. And for instance, I think that what has been done regarding national rules cleaning has been a very good initiative. So so overlaps and contradiction with TSI have been more or less eradicated. So I think this is very good. And even if there are still some discussions between ERA and some NSA, which are preventing from fully close the topic in some countries, I think it's a good improvement. It's a good way forward. But unfortunately, there are still some details, and details are very important in our world, which are not fixed, and which and this is making, I would say, the life of our working level very difficult in our company. For instance, the SRD, which is the single rule database, is not yet ready, and it should encompass national rule and safety rules for rolling stock and infra, but it does not exist. Then there is no baseline which is easy to access to. And so we need to go to the NSA websites, but we are not sure information here is really updated. And so in addition, OSS is not interfaced to SRD, to RDD, to ERTV. And so we need to duplicate manually all the information. And so, this is not very efficient. So I think there are still some tools or some, I would say, fluidity to be achieved. It has to be more easy to work with. And so I think, it sounds that the agency has been given a very large leading role, which is very good. But it seems that sometimes they do not have the means nor resources they should have to run the job it triggers. And so it is clearly something which is very much jeopardizing the progress and the improvement and the basics of the fourth railway package implementation.
Yeah, thank you, Nicola. That was a question I was about to put to Cleo, actually, and I will now do so. Does ERA have the resources it needs to fulfil the mandate it's been given?
Thank you, Chris. You know that I'm chairing the ERA Management Board now for some time, and I just started my second mandate. And so it's true that this is very much a subject we are discussing in the board. And we are now considering addressing really the budget authorities in the European Union, really because we feel that there is a problem, that the agency does not receive the proper funding to do its work. And you lost me again.
No.
No, it's okay.
You're fine.
Okay. Oh, I'm good. Okay, because my apparatus just went. Okay, it's okay. As long as you hear me, that's good. So I was saying that we feel that there is a problem with the resources that the agency is receiving and the finance. So we are both speaking of budget and human resources, certainly. So the board is really considering addressing the budgetary authorities in the EU, because we believe there is a challenge with that. On the other hand, you also know that the agency has been charged with collecting fees and charges. And so this is another part of the solution, or perhaps of the problem at the moment, because we have been trying to realign these fees and charges with the reality of the cost for the agency, because this is what the regulation foresees. And we are now trying to convince member states how much this is needed. Problem is, of course, that the alignment of these fees and charges with the reality of the cost for the agency has to be agreed within the risk, which is a situation where there is a political challenge here for us to try to convince member states of this importance. On the other hand, we see no other solution. For us, we have to cover the cost of the authorizations, and therefore, of course, we understand that for the sector, it is a very important thing that they receive good value for their money. And this is why this will not just go with higher fees, but we must also focus on the processes. And we have just started yesterday, really, the exercise of a return of experience on the implementation of the fourth railway package. It was an initiative from the executive director. And we really want to make this exercise real within the board, because we believe that looking back on the implementation of the fourth railway package, not just from the agency's perspective, but from the whole European system, a rail system, is very important, because we all have to gain on maturity, and this will help with streamlining the processes. And therefore, in this regard, we really want this to make an exercise common with the sector. And I'm very grateful also to UNIFE for contributing very actively to this exercise of feedback on experience on the implementation of the fourth rail package. And we want to make sure that we look at the situation very objectively with all the problems that the sector want to share with us. And we want to look at solutions not only from the agency's perspective, but again, from a system perspective. So what we are hoping to achieve is putting recommendations to the different authorities, including the European Commission, to see what can be amended, possibly also in the legal framework, and to stop, to gain on efficiency really altogether. So this is really what the board has been trying to do very recently now. Thank you.
So, sounds very positive, but no doubt with the member states, it's like pushing treacle uphill, I would say. In terms of the costs, yes, nobody likes paying more for a service, but I think the challenge will be to demonstrate that that the cost savings in one area are more than offset the extra charges in another. And the question, I guess, are you paying internally within a country, or are you paying external to an external agency? And there's going to have to be further work on that score. But it sounds like things are going the right way. In terms of the national rules, I mean, there's still work to be done on cleaning up. Is that an area where resources are an issue between the agency and the national authorities in terms of actually carrying on that streamlining process, or is that something else that's delivering cost savings?
No, Chris, very clearly so, because as Cleo has described, we are squeezed on two fronts. We are squeezed on the budget front, but we are in particular squeezed on the resources front. It's a good thing that our resources required are now double what was, or more than double what was originally projected, because we receive many more applications for authorization than predicted. We have now, for vehicle authorization, a pretty good forecasting process with our applicants, but normally the reality is always higher than the forecast. That means that we cannot spend the resources on the reduction of national rules, because coincidentally, the experts are the same that work on vehicle authorization than would normally work on national rules. Of course, within concrete authorization cases, we tackle the issue of national rules, but that is the reactive mode. But what we need to do is the proactive mode. And Nicola gave some other example, SRD, the integration of OSS with the registers. In 2019, the funding of the OSS was cut by the Commission. Yeah, so now we need to do the minimum because we don't have the resources. If we had the appropriate support, we could long have integrated some of the features Nicola was talking about, but we cannot do it. And just to put the funding in perspective, I recently gave the comparison with the Brenner Tunnel project, where about 10 billion of euros are invested to cut the travel time by 55 minutes, meaning 180 million per minute travel time. And still, currently, trains wait at the border for 30 minutes because of the non-integration of national rules. So reduction of national rules, harmonization of national rules would have a very high payoff and would be investment very well spent. And it would be certainly in the interest of the industry to have all these informations, because industry are paying many times. Nicola mentioned that his staff have to go into the details. They have to look up at the websites of the NSAs. This could be done once in a centralized action and then published in the SRD. But now we just shift the work to the industry, which is very, very ineffective.
Absolutely, because every player is doing the same work over and over again. I think it's the classic truism, of course, that that politicians like cutting the ribbons on new infrastructure. They're much less interested in doing the detail behind the scenes. Yes, as Elena points out, yes, it would be very valuable to the passengers as well to save 30 minutes and to have an improved service. I totally agree. I think there is still work to be done in this area. One question we skipped over that I had lined up. We're getting back to the global competition. We talked about using European standards to enable manufacturers to compete in the global market, but I mean, how far is the sort of exporting of the European standards TSI norms model? Joseph, I know you've been sort of liaising with people like the railways in the Gulf region who are trying to build a new regulatory regime from scratch. Is the standard structure that we have in Europe something that can be exported en masse, or is it something that informs other people's processes rather than duplicates them?
Well, you gave the example of the Gulf Cooperation Council, and there the feedback was that indeed they liked the European framework, and we see it from other regions of the world as well, that the approach is very much liked. But again, we need to do our homework internally, because export can only rely when you have a strong working reference at home, and we need to make sure that it really works. And one aspect should be important: when we authorize a vehicle in Europe according to the European standards, this authorization should be recognized worldwide, so that industry can then export with already the label authorized in Europe, and then the additional present by the relevant authority in the target country is restricted to their national rules, but the basics are already done by us.
Absolutely. So moving the cross acceptance model that we had in the early days of Europe into a global. Elena, is this cross acceptance something that the international standardization bodies can assist with in terms of?
Yes, thank you. Actually, Chris, this is one of our major objectives. One standard, one test, accepted everywhere. And this is something that is driving the international standardization community. And as I mentioned before, CEN and CENELEC are extremely committed to the international standards development. But I also agree with Joseph that we need to do our homework well, to organize, to be able to identify where we can make a difference, and to make sure that we can use this competitive edge in the right way. So from the European standardization perspective, what we are doing is having a lot of discussions with other regions in the world. You have mentioned the Gulf, where we have got a very strong cooperation with the Gulf Standardization Council. Africa is extremely important these days, where Africa is building the African Union, and they are looking into the European quality infrastructure in order to see if they can take some of the components of the European model. Extremely important also for the railway sector. India, that is a member of ISO and IEC. China, that is a member of ISO and IEC. And what is the CEN-CENELEC strategy in this way? What we are trying to do, and this is pretty difficult, is to make sure that these countries that have got the national standardization body established contribute to the international standardization development and make those international standards happening in their own country. And for that, we have got connections with the Standards Authority of China. They have got the Standardization Strategy 2030. And this is where the geopolitical aspect comes into the game, because we need to make sure that our policies are consistent, that when the EU negotiates a trade agreement with a third country, reciprocity is ensured, and that we can agree on the technical requirements because I think that we want the same level of safety and interoperability for everybody. But at the same time, we are sure that we have a fair level playing field to get access to our market. So for sure, standardization will contribute to this mutual recognition of certificates and results, but it needs to be accompanied by a consistent trade policy and, as I mentioned before, by a consistent industrial policy. And there, okay, we have many challenges to address.
Absolutely. I think the political issues have popped up in every aspect of this debate, from the national rules to geopolitical trade policy. We obviously haven't got time to discuss all of those now. The clock is ticking. Can I just invite my four panelists to each give us one takeaway bullet point that they'd like our viewers to remember as in terms of where we're going with the whole standardization issue. And ladies first, I'm going to start with Cleo. So what's your big point?
Thank you very much, Chris. Flexibility in regulation will come with liability, will be my sentence. Thank you.
Flexible regulation and liability. Lovely. Okay. Nicolas, would you like to go next?
Yes. So for me, the main motto should be stability of the regulation system, which doesn't mean freeze, but stability, flexibility, fluidity, and make the life of our working level guys in our company easier. And so why not to pay a little bit more for ERA, but we don't want to have the double punishment, so more money to ERA and still more complexity.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So make life easy. Standards at the service of everybody, totally. Elena.
Okay, so I would say market-driven, voluntary European standards will enable innovation-friendly European legislation and competitiveness for the European and the global market.
Excellent, excellent. Market-driven evolution. And Joseph, last word from you.
Well, it's very difficult because I subscribe to all the statements that I heard before, but perhaps just trying to combine, I started at the beginning from the customer perspective, and this has to be very important. We need to have simplicity and consistency, meaning to make the system understandable, and at the same time it has to be future-proof. So we need to do regulation with a mindset looking towards the future, not towards the past. We can always learn from the past, as I did by quoting the example of the track gauge in the UK, but we need to look forward. And if we combine all these aspects, I'm sure we will have a very good regulatory and standardization system.
Absolutely. Learn from the past, look to the future. Thank you very much. An excellent point to end. Well, it's been an absolutely fascinating discussion, and I'd like to thank all four of you very much indeed. But now can I hand over to Unifay Director General Philippe Citroën, who's just going to make some concluding remarks. Philippe.
Thank you for giving the floor, Chris, and I'd like to thank you for the moderation of today's session, and I thank the panel. Thank Cleo, Elena, Joseph, and Nicolas for the exchange of views and the expertise shared. This morning's session provided a nice opportunity to step back and assess the wider view of the full system and reconsider the motivations for reaching the single European railway area, what has been achieved already over past years and what further can be accomplished in the coming years. I thank the panel for the interesting discussion and insight into their vision for Europe's rail. I think we received a good balance of views from the different sides, both EU and national authorities, European standardization organization, and the rail supply industry. Unifay looks forward to the continuing cooperation within the rail sector as we continue to promote the competitiveness. I think this word is absolutely essential, the competitiveness of rail as the most sustainable and safe mode of mass land transport in the framework, because we didn't mention it, of the European Green Deal, which is the priority of the Commission and of the Member States. I would like just to mention that it has been said, there's so many experts from the rail sectors working in, for example, on what you call the package TSI 2022 on technical standards, and there are a lot of working groups that have been mentioned: ERA working group, SEN working group, SENELEC working group, ISO, and also all our experts of our companies are really having a very intensive activity, and we have to be a bit careful not to have too many activities at the same time. And I would like to come back to what has been said during debate, and for UNIFE, we would like to stress the importance to find the correct balance between bringing technical progress and innovation to the market and the stability and predictability of the regulations for railways projects. Finally, I would like to say one thing. You can recall UNIFE's strong support for the adoption of the technical pillar, and in particular of a harmonized, quicker and cheaper European vehicle authorization process, and we must not forget the RTMS track time. We were very happy that yesterday, together with between Clio and the executive director of ERA, they have decided to organize, because after 2 years of experience and with all the member states on board since the end of 2020 on the transposition of the fourth railway package, it is important to see that they are going to organize a first reflection between all rail actors on the impacts of the fourth railway package, and when necessary, identify ways in which to improve the current practice and ensure what is certainly the most important thing of the fourth railway package, the technical pillar, the expected time and cost benefits, and that is very important. So I end again by thanking all the participants, and our next debate, which is in the framework of the European Year of Rail, will be at the end of the month of August on IRIS, or the certification of IRIS, and on ERTMS at the end of the month of September. So again, thank you very much, and it was a pleasure to have you with us, and thank you for the participants on this online event, and have a nice day. Thank you very much.